My name is Max Sawicky. I'm at least the nominal head of this webinar, although I barely know what I'm doing in Zoom. And I want to, before we do anything, I wanted to thank some people for helping to set this up. Jamie Partridge, Mindy Isser, Mike Rahowski, Amy Zachmeyer, Jess Pinkham for help in organizing this. I'm in the Metro DC chapter, and we have 4 presentations, 5 actual speakers, and I'll just say I want to leave most of the time for them to talk rather than for me to blather on at the beginning. So I'm just going to introduce them very briefly. We have Jan Simpson, who's the president of the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. We have Steve DeMatteo from the American Postal Workers Union. We have Mark Armstrong from the Public Banking Institute. We have James, I'm going to say James O, rather than butchering his name, and John P from New York City DSA. And we'll begin with President Simpson. Just a few words of housekeeping. There's a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen, and we'll have time at the end for questions and answers, but we're asking attendees to put their questions in the Q&A box, and I will call on the presenters who are queried as we go along for that. I would also suggest to the presenters that they mute unless they're going to speak, which I just failed to do while my wife was breaking pottery or something in the background. And I think with that, I was going to speak at more length, but now we have other people, so I have less work to do. I'll just note that I wrote a report on postal banking for the US, and rather than rehash that at stultifying length, I'll just post a link to that. I only want to say 3 things about the subject matter. One is that when we talk about socializing different types of industry in the US, there's a tendency to focus on the benefits for the public employees, which are, I think, not in dispute. And there's the benefit of foregoing certain costs in terms of excessive profits. And what I think maybe doesn't get cited often enough is the actual benefit of the service itself to people, that it would be worth it to the average person, even if they had to pay for it entirely themselves. I think that's a hallmark of public services. It's the benefits for the consumers. We want people to want these services, and we want to be able to show that they're worth it to them, even if they're asked to pay something for them. Secondly, in terms of the Postal Service in the US, there's really 2 agendas. One is the short term, which is getting rid of the Postmaster General, DeJoy, who's a crook and a Trump crony. And the other is making sure it's financially supported in the immediate sense, because Congress enacted legislation which cripples it financially, or would if it was followed through on. The longer term is more what we're about in this seminar, which is things the Postal Service could do if it was adequately funded, and new areas that it could break into to the benefit of the country. And third, we're going to have a presentation on public banking, and the main difference as far as what I want to talk about right now is just that postal banking typically for the US would be a federal government operation, which suggests that it would have enormous benefits of scale. It would be able to do some things more cheaply because it was huge. Public banks in principle could be federal, state, or local, or something, or regional. There's been talk for years about a national infrastructure bank, but the state and local governments don't necessarily have to wait for that to start going down that road themselves. So they're related because there'd be an overlap in what these two different types of institutions could do, postal versus public. But we're going to have separate talks about each. Some people here will talk about postal in terms of a very broad range of functions. So with that, I think we can go to President Jan Simpson of the Canadian Postal Workers. And she has a PowerPoint, which we'll be jumping back and forth from, hopefully without any technical glitches. So with that, Jan, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you very much, Max, and welcome everybody to the webinar today. And thank you for taking time away from your families to be part of it. So like you said, I'm Jan Simpson. I'm the National President for the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Before I begin, I want to acknowledge I'm speaking to you from unceded Anishinaabe territory. So the first slide needs to go up. So we're on to the second slide now, please. Okay. So postal banking encompasses different financial services and can include all that is listed on the screen in front of you. Postal banking is not a new or radical idea. Postal banks already exist in many parts of the world. Over 1 billion people have accounts at postal banks right now. But postal banking, it helps to increase financial inclusion, it promotes economic development, and it generates revenue to preserve public postal services and good public jobs. Next one, please. The big banks have quite the monopoly in Canada, and because of the monopoly, customer service doesn't seem to be a top priority, and we've seen that really truly happen during the pandemic. What we are seeing across the country is bank closures in rural and small communities, forcing customers to travel long distances to get banking services. You might say it's not a big deal because we do everything online right now, but to seniors and those who are not comfortable with technology, and those who have not very reliable internet services, it makes a big difference, and a physical bank is truly a necessity. Let's not forget the countless Indigenous communities who are not served by the big banks either. Next slide, please. The Canadian banking industry is portrayed as a model of stability and good management, but a lot of this is due to the regulations that govern it right now. In reality, the big banks are focused on one thing, and that's profits. They emphasize profits over services, which is why we see service cuts, bank closures, and high fees across this country. It is the most profitable sector of the economy. The big banks in 2018, the 5 top ones in Canada, they made $43.5 billion. That's $120 million per day. Canadians, we need reliable, affordable banks that can focus on our needs instead of the corporate greed. The next slide, please. Canadians pay on average $185 in service fees annually. And according to a study by Auxera Consulting Limited, Canada had among the 3 highest annual fees on current accounts for students, for low-income families, and for pensioners. They have a better record of servicing the middle and high-income earners. And the ATM fees that we have are one of the most expensive in the world. We have a population that has increased by about 25% over the past 30 years, but the number of bank branches has decreased by 22% during that time. The closures they mostly happened in rural areas, but also in low income areas in urban cities. Next slide, please. The National Symposium on Financial Capability found evidence of financial exclusion of low income people. Between 3 to 5% of low income Canadians are unbanked. Many are also underbanked. Rural Canadians with bank accounts that rarely access banking services, plus people with bank accounts that rely on fringe financial institutions, especially low-income people and Indigenous people. In Prince George, British Columbia, for example, a study found that 50% of the Indigenous population who use fringe financial services, such as Payday Lenders, also had bank accounts. The next slide. We've already mentioned the high fees and bank closures as barriers to accessible banking services, but low-income people face even more barriers. There are more identification requirements to open an account, And many people don't have the proper identification to open the accounts. Also, you have unexpected fees. They also want to hold your checks, and you can't even get a line of credit if you do need one. There's a fear of potential liens on their accounts. There's a low literacy, numeracy, and our language skills. And there's a sense of intimidation, fear, and stigma of low confidence on financial matters as well. The next slide. Indigenous people face even more barriers to accessible banking than most of us for many reasons. There's a lack of mainstream financial services in First Nation and Northern and rural communities. There's a mistrust of non-Indigenous institutions as well. There's also the language barrier. There's also difficulty accessing capital for entrepreneurship. But also in the Indian Act, there's a limitation on the use of your land and your housing for collaterals, which kind of limit your access to getting loans as well. Next slide, please. What happens when a community experiences barriers to banking? For our Indigenous population, it means 4.2% do not have a bank account and double the rate of Canadians overall. Our studies estimate that the unbanked and underbanked Indigenous populations to be about 15%. In Ontario, there are only 5 First Nations with banks or credit unions on their reserves. Next, please. Systemic racism is a problem in Canada, and it prevents people from accessing banking services. The example mentioned on the screen is not an isolated incident. Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience this type of racial profiling all the time, and it limits our ability to access banking services. Next, please. Large banks have been closing operations in small towns and villages. A Canadian Postmaster and Assistants Association study found that 1,178 communities with a post office had no bank or credit union in their community. Provinces with high rates of financial exclusion include Newfoundland and Labrador at 84%, Nova Scotia at 65%, and British Columbia at 61%. Next, please. This is a map of Newfoundland, which shows you the number of bank branches across Newfoundland. You notice there's not a lot of them there, and it's all in one concentrated area on the map. Next, please. And here's a map of Newfoundland and Labrador showing you all the Canada Post locations we have across that province. You'll notice that there are far more post offices there. It's a great chance for us to have postal banking there, and it's spread all across the province, not just in one small area. Next, please. And now we see payday lenders have moved in and filled the void left by banks in many communities. Businesses that they provide short-term loans, normally for small amounts of money. There's about 1,400 retail stores in Canada currently, and 3 large chains take about 80% of the business right now. They made about $2.5 billion in annual revenue, and they have about 2 million customers here in Canada alone. Stats Canada found that 3% of families have taken out a payday loan within the previous 3 years, and many of them were very young families. The Ipsos Reid poll found that 22% of payday lenders' clients use these companies at least once a month. Payday lenders are meeting the demands for small loans and check cashings, but they charge a very, very high rate for these loans. Next, please. So an average loan of $300 for 14 days will cost you $51 in interest and extra fees. That's an equivalent of an interest rate of 443%. Once you start getting these loans, you can never get yourself out of this situation. It's like a real bad situation to be in. And a lot of people, unfortunately, keep going to these payday lenders. Next, please. Across the world, postal banks, they exist to provide high quality service, affordable services to everyone, everywhere. And I know in Canada, we can also have this service. And next. There is not just one approach of postal banking. For example, La Banque Postale is one of France's 5 biggest banks. They offer a complete range of services to individuals, to municipalities, NGOs, small and large businesses. At the other end of the scale is the Australian Postal Bank, which offers deposits and withdrawals for the private sector banks at all of its post office outlets. One thing is for certain, Canada has many models to look to when we decide to open our postal bank. Next, please. The question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we make postal banking happen in Canada today? Next. Postal banking isn't new in Canada. We had it until about the late 1960s. While Canada Post is more often than not resistant to the idea, there have been some support over the years. For example, in 1982, the first president of Canada Post suggested that the post office could step into serving the 2,000 communities that had post offices but didn't have any banks. In 1998, Andre Ouellette told a parliamentary committee that Canada Post used to provide banking services and suggested that the corporation do it again. And in 2010, Moya Green told Canada Post Senate that she was giving serious consideration to providing a more traditional and generalized banking offer. Next. At CUPW, we launched our campaign for postal banking or some sort of financial services in 2012. We did our research, we gained support from municipalities, the labor movement, and communities. Even members of parliament showed interest, as did our members. We promoted postal banking with an international conferences by publishing white papers and talking to communities. Next. While we were looking to expand services and create new revenue streams for the post office, management had another idea. They wanted to eliminate home delivery of the mail and replace it with community mailboxes. They wanted to close and privatize our retail counters. They wanted huge pay increases for postage, and they wanted to attack the workers' pensions. Next. In 2016, we launched our campaign, Delivering Community Power, which is our vision of the post office for the future. It includes financial services, a renewable energy postal fleet, electric vehicle charging stations at post offices, letter carrier senior check-in services, post offices as community hubs, and a consolidated last mile delivery. Next. Our campaign attracted a lot of attention and a lot of support. As of today, 1,000 municipalities have signed on and passed resolutions to support postal banking. Almost 2 out of 3 respondents, about 63%, to a poll that was done in 2013 by StratCon Canada, said they were supporting Canada Post expanding services, including financial services, insurance, and postal banking. We have support from the New Democratic Party as well as the Green Party of Canada. Next, please. Canada Post conducted a secret 4-year study on postal banking in 2009 to 2013 that indicates this service would be a win-win strategy. Unfortunately, we've never seen the study yet because it's all been redacted. So, for us, this is a really big opportunity for Canada Post to move forward. Next. The postal banking was an issue during the last round of bargaining for the urban and the rural suburban mail carriers bargaining units. After talks broke down, we went on strike. We used our right to strike, and the government imposed back to work legislation and forced us back to work. We've had an arbitrated settlement imposed in June of 2020, and it included language on postal banking. In her decision, the arbitrator said, the corporation and the union commit to working collaboratively during the life of the collective agreement on the select set of new financial services. And in December, right now, we are still consulting with management on how we can do financial services. Next. The big banks are abandoning our communities. Canadians deserve accessible financial services, and the post office is more than ready and capable to provide the service. So we're just waiting now for us to continue, but we need the support. I encourage you to go to cupw.ca and follow our campaign on postal banking, because it's with your support that we're going to get Canada Post to push forward and have postal banking. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Simpson. Now we'll go to Steve DiMatteo from the American Postal Workers Union.
Thanks, Max. Really appreciate the chance to join you all. And I just want to, off the top, thank the entire DSA, especially the DSLC, for really incredible solidarity over the past year, standing up for the Postal Service. We've been really humbled to see socialists all across the country join us in making calls to Congress, doing virtual town halls, those absolutely gorgeous postcards that One Chapter designed. I know a lot of folks ordered those and sent them in. Care packages for our members and for letter carriers. The DSA has really shown up for postal workers in a big way in a really difficult year, and we see it and we appreciate it. So thanks for that, appreciate it, and thanks for the chance to chat a little bit today about postal banking, which is one of my favorite hobby horses and a real priority for our union as well. we're supposed to talk about postal banking, but the line I always tell people is there's no postal banking if there's not a public postal service. So I think it's worth just a couple minutes talking about what this past year has been like in some of the broader context as well. Since the 1970s, I'd say conservatives in both major parties have had a target on the back of the Postal Service. Here we have one of the few publicly owned institutions in this country, home to hundreds of thousands of good, unionized, family-sustaining, working-class jobs, including disproportionate shares of people of color and of women, that provides a public service that everybody relies on, and to Max's earlier point, is actually universally beloved, and people use it and rely upon it, and with a few exceptions, find it to be a really good and important service provided to the public. While various presidential administrations and Congresses over the past 40 or 50 years have been hostile at worst or ambivalent perhaps at best with respect to the Postal Service and to postal workers, I'd suggest that none has been quite as hostile as the Trump administration over the past 4 years. I should note that in 2018, a White House report openly called for the privatization of the Postal Service. In the springtime, I think it was in March 2018, it was an OMB report. They walked that back a little bit later in the year in a task force report on the Postal Service that didn't openly suggest privatization, but put forth what we argued was the pathway to privatization. It was massive cuts in services, increases in prices, restructuring of the Postal Service, basically getting it on the trajectory to where they could spin it off and sell it to their friends on Wall Street. Thankfully, because of public pressure, including the DSA and other allies and just regular users of the mail, regular people that depend on and rely on the Postal Service every day, we've been able to stop them from doing pursuing most of their agenda to any success. But it's important to note that that's sort of who we've been up against in the last 4 years. And of course, I'll talk a little bit about Louis DeJoy as well. So that's who we had. In addition to the ridiculous pre-funding mandate that Max mentioned and touches upon in his great paper, and I encourage everybody to take a look at that. And that was, if you don't know, sort of an arcane accounting requirement put in place by bipartisan consensus in 2006 that since that time has bled the Postal Service of billions of dollars that it otherwise could have been using to invest in new products and services, in a more climate-friendly fleet, a safer fleet for letter carriers as well, retrofitting buildings to be more climate-friendly, and better places to work, and all sorts of other things that have not just investments that they failed to make, but really put the Postal Service in a financial crisis even before the pandemic started. And then, of course, when we got into COVID times, we saw the immediate effects of the pandemic on the Postal Service. Some classes of mail were down as much as 50%. And this White House, even with bipartisan support in Congress for relief for the Postal Service, stood in the way because they have an agenda to privatize the Postal Service and to sell it off to their friends on Wall Street. And then, of course, in the summertime this year, we saw when DeJoy got hired by the Board of Governors and immediately set out on a path to cut services. We were really impressed and honored and proud of the public outcry that followed from those service cuts. Certainly, with our eyes wide open, we recognize that a lot of the public were, with good reason, concerned about the effects of those service cuts on the election. But we also think that they were demonstrations of the public's love of the Postal Service and appreciation of the Postal Service and the work that our members do every single day. So ultimately this year, we've got the Postal Service, at least with respect to the election and vote by mail, to do the right thing. We've stopped DeJoy from making the biggest cuts that he had hoped to make. We know that that success is only temporary. He's already said in congressional testimony and in the Postal Service's public reports that they've got a really aggressive plan to make the Postal Service solvent that they intend to pursue. And it's certainly not a plan that postal workers are expecting to be able to support. We would fully anticipate that those are additional cuts, things like the types of cuts he tried to pursue through the summer and the early fall. And we all need to be ready to stand up and show the forces that we were able to mobilize all around the country this summer. We got to be ready to do that again when DeJoy starts to pursue his cuts again very soon. So despite that sort of challenging context, I guess, or political environment, I have to say I'm really optimistic about the chance to make some progress on postal banking in the next few years. I think in some respects, the organizing and the mobilization we've been able to do this summer have demonstrated the public support for the Postal Service. And really the moment, and I think in so many ways the pandemic contributes to this, the moment shows just how important public services like the Postal Service are to the public. People have seen what the Postal Service is capable of, even in the face of a hostile administration and Congress that wasn't able to get the job done, and in the face of management like Louis DeJoy that has been hostile, many would suggest, to the public mission of the post office. And when we think about the effect of the pandemic, as it continues to wear on, killing 3,000 people a day, there's tens of millions of people that are out of work, facing foreclosure, unable to get health care. I think people are crying out for solutions and public solutions and universal solutions, and the Postal Service is certainly well positioned to be a part of that response. The situation in the US is not dissimilar from what Jan suggested. There's a massive crisis of people that are underbanked and underbanked. Max, I saw put the FDIC report in the chat. If you dig into that, you'll see that there are 80 million people in this country that are either unbanked or underbanked. Those people spend on average 10% of their income every single year on fees and interest for non-bank financial services. And those are things like payday loans and expensive wire transfers that Jan mentioned are problematic in Canada. They're problematic here as well. People are paying, millions of people still pay exorbitant fees to access their own money at ATMs. And another thing where we think about the pandemic, where we think about the failure of the current financial system in this country, when there was the $1,200 stimulus check that was due to go out in the springtime, there were millions of people that were never going to get the money that they were lawfully, that they had rights to access. I think the last I checked, there were still 9 million people who didn't get their $1,200 check, either because they didn't have a bank account or they didn't have an established relationship with the IRS. And the Postal Service could fill the gap, and postal banking could fill the gap in that type of systemic failure as well. As Jan suggested, we know it works. It works all around the world. Nearly 2 billion people in 140 countries already can access financial services at their postal service or at their post office. We had postal banking in this country from 1911 to 1967. And even today, the Postal Service still provides quite a lot of financial services. Over $20 billion in money orders go through the post office every year. There's quite a sizable amount of money that passes through wire transfer done at the post office, although I would suggest that's one area where we are woefully underserved. The current relationship that the USPS has with other countries vis-a-vis the international wire transfer is limited to only a handful of countries. We ought to join the worldwide system, the international financial system run by the Universal Postal Union, that would allow you to send money from post office to post office anywhere around the world. One of the things I think we should consider a real attribute as well about the United States Postal Service is our members, postal workers, and the members of the other unions are very trusted. The post office is the most trusted federal agency in the country, and postal workers have approval ratings that it might not surprise you are light years ahead of the major financial institutions in this country. Our campaign in the past few years has been focused upon forcing the post office to try out some pilot projects. Our demands have actually been quite modest. We see it as a step towards a more robust, full-fledged postal banking system. We've collected hundreds of thousands of petitions around the country, including with the support of DSA chapters, especially in New York. I know your crew there have been incredibly active over the past number of years, and we appreciate that. We've worked with members of Congress to improve legislation and increase their pressure on the Postal Service. And we want to do this not just because it would back up the post office's finances, although it would. There was a 2014 report from the Postal Inspector General that suggested a full suite of postal financial services could bring in excess of $1 billion in revenue a year, and that would improve our bargaining position and improve the financial health of the Postal Service. That's all great, and we want to do that for those reasons, but it's not the only reason. We don't want to replicate the abuses of the existing system with a postal bank either. We pursue this campaign, we run this campaign, we educate and mobilize our members around this because we know it's the right thing to do and because there's a massive need that is unaddressed in this country right now. And we think that the Postal Service is well positioned to address that need, not just to improve the financial health of the post office. Look, our members are dedicated public servants. They really believe in that. There's a line in the federal law that says the mission of the Postal Service is to, quote, bind the nation together. Obviously, we do that every single day by providing the exchange of correspondence and goods. We think building a postal financial system that can contribute to social cohesion by folks being included in the financial system for the first time, 80 million of them, is absolutely an extension of that very mission that our members are so proud to carry out every single day. We're in every neighborhood. We're not going away. We've proved just what postal workers can do over the last few months with this election. Want to encourage everybody to stay with us, to stay on side, to recognize that we still have a massive fight on our hands to save the post office. And if I want to leave folks with a couple of action items, things you can do, it's pick up the phone, call Congress, urge them to support real serious relief for the Postal Service in COVID. We've been looking at $25 billion in relief to keep the Postal Service afloat in these pandemic times. And another discrete thing, I can get into it perhaps in a bit more detail later, although it's not a massive thing. There is an amendment in the appropriations process right now that would basically force the Postal Service to pursue small pilot programs on expanded financial services and give them a little bit of money to do it as well. And if you want to call Congress and urge them to support postal relief in the pandemic, you can also ask them to support the Pascrell Chapter amendment that is going to be fought over in the next few days. So really glad to have the chance to address everybody on this webinar and hope we can answer some questions at the end. Thanks, Max.
Thanks, Steve. Great timing discipline there. I hope everybody else can follow that. I'll just interject two things. Right now, in terms of stimulus, they're talking about 900 billion or more. And against that, any objections to putting 25 billion into keeping the mail going is, I think, ridiculous. So there's a pretty strong political position there. I don't know if Steve mentioned it. I could have blanked on it, but I believe Senator Sanders and Gillibrand have a postal banking bill. I haven't heard too much about it so far, but that's also something from which to work. And with that, let's go to Mark Armstrong of the Public Banking Institute, who's going to talk more about public bankings than postal banking per se.
Great. Thank you, Max. I'm going to start off with just a quick little story to add color to what Steve was talking about. You know, we really do need to keep in mind what the problem is that we're trying to solve. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was driving down, I live in Western Virginia, it's a rural area, and I was driving down the road, there was an elderly woman hitchhiking, which you don't typically see. And I pulled over and picked her up and started chatting with her. She had just been paid with a check for $55, and she needed to pay off it was the end of the month. She needed to pay off the electric and utilities, as well as a couple of other vendors. And so I was happy to drive her around, and she was paying $5, $8, 20 some odd dollars to different places. And the reason why I bring this up is because the issue with her having a bank account, as well as scores of millions of other folks in this country, is that banks have been called on the carpet before for basically paying bills before deposits are made. And so the poor person who has that account gets hit with $35, $40 overdraft amount charges. And there's no way she could afford something like that. And that is the prime reason many folks do not do banking. They don't have bank accounts because of overdraft charges. They would much rather pay something less to a check casher, and then either have the check casher structure and sequence the bills they need to be paid, or they go one by one to different places to pay them. And so that's the problem we're trying to solve. So let me give you a little context with regards to public banking versus postal banking. There is an overlap. I'll talk about that in just a minute. But basically, let's talk about what makes a bank a bank. I mean, we have all been taught that incorrectly that banks are institutions that take in money as deposits and then lend them out. And just think about that for a minute. If that were true, you and I would be banks, because we can take money in and lend it out. That doesn't make us a bank. That doesn't make a corporation a bank. What makes a bank is they get a license from the state or the federal government to basically do a type of lending that allows them to basically hold credit on their balance sheet. And it's very simple what happens. And I don't want to confuse things at all, but just keep this in mind. What happens is when a bank makes a loan to them is an asset. So let's say they make a $100 loan. They write it in as $100 on their asset side of their balance sheet. We all know what a balance sheet is. You need to have a liability to offset that new asset in order to balance the books. And in the case of that $100 loan, another $100 would be written into the deposit account, which is a liability from the bank's perspective, and so that their books balance. That is carrying credit on their balance sheet. That is what a bank does. It does not take money out of the vault. As a matter of fact, if you look at vaults these days in banks and credit unions, they're open. Money is no longer what it was 100 years ago. Only 3% of the money is physical these days. It's all basically either digital or is just a concept held on the books of these banks. And so keep in mind what makes a bank is that license that they have to carry credit on their books, to write loans into their books as an asset, as well as to write that same loan into a deposit account or a checking account. And so that is significant, because what's been done in California, you've probably heard a little over a year ago, AB 857 was passed. That whole bill was about the license for public banks in California, basically the rules of the game. What would a public banking license look like versus what they had today before then, which was a commercial banking license. And so the focus on the license is really important when people are doing public banking work. Now let me talk a little bit about comparison of public banks and postal banks. So a postal bank can be involved in 3 different ways. Actually, I'm going to go over 2, and then I'll do the third one later on. But a postal bank could get a license to be a public bank, and so it would have depository accounts and it could issue credit. Okay, so that's one way a postal bank could be set up, and so it would be officially a depository institution, and it would have these deposit checking accounts for everybody who opens up a banking account with them. Another way to do it is what fintech companies do. And fintech companies are basically software companies that are not banking institutions. They partner with banks or credit unions. A good example of this is Dwolla. Dwala has been on the scene for, oh gosh, at least 8 years or so now. And Dwala has a single account with a credit union in Iowa, in the state of Iowa. And they have all these sub accounts for the people who subscribe to them or open accounts with them. So Dwala actually is the account holder with the credit union. And through its software, it manages transfers of money, payments of bills, et cetera. And so that's another way to do it. So in that case, if the postal bank were not officially a bank, not a depository bank, it could have a relationship with another bank where the bank would be holding the main account, and the postal bank could do all these sub accounts, much like Dwala does. And so in that case, the bank would look like software on a phone or on a computer. And if people cannot perform the service themselves, they could actually go into the bank and the postal bank or the post office, and the person behind the counter can actually do the transaction for them. So I'm bringing up this distinction because many times when we talk about banking, we're only focused on retail banking. And as I said, there's two flavors of that. There's this whole other side, which a lot of public banking is involved with, and that's the issuance of credit. And that is a possibility. And that is actually one of the main reasons why there's a lot of resistance to post offices becoming postal banks, because of the fear that the issuance of credit would be misused. And so that's something that we need to be aware of and be kind of cautious about, because credit can be misunderstood. So for instance, if somebody overdrafts their account and they have overdraft protection of up to $100, let's say, is that credit or is that just a feature of their checking account? And so there's this knowledge about financial services that need to be brought to bear, and you can actually turn credit into a feature like that, and actually it would work quite well with a postal bank, and actually we would not get into the conversation about whether or not the bank is lending money. They're just providing overdraft protection. There's a third way that a public bank and postal banks could work together. And that is that a public bank for the state of California, let's say, could have the license to provide banking services. And there's all this talk about credit and issuing credit in California for infrastructure, but that license for providing banking services could also extend to addressing the unbanked issue that's prevalent throughout California. And so the Public Bank of California could have a partnership with the US Postal Service, let's say, and basically the Public Bank of California would say, you know what, we've developed this software, we want to roll it out to users, and we can do that without the Postal Service. However, there's always going to be customer support that's going to be required. And so what we would like the USPS to do is to provide that customer support within each of the post offices within the state of California. So a person would walk into the post office and say, I need to deposit this check into my account and I can't figure out how to do it. The postal clerk would say, fine, I'll do it for you. And the transaction occurs. The software is owned or licensed by the state of California's public bank, but the Postal Service would be providing a customer support service to that particular customer. And so because there is so much talk about public banking these days in various forms, that is one form that could take shape. It's not discussed much these days in terms of, there's no bill or anything like that that's been written. It's pretty early on in the process, but I want to let folks know that postal banking can be outsourced completely to a public bank, except for the customer support piece, and that support could be provided fabulously by the clerks behind the counter. And so that's another very important version of postal banking. Stephen talked about the possibility of pilots. That would be a great pilot to start up in New York City or the state of California or the state of New Jersey for that matter, since the governor's been talking about public banking. Nationwide, there are a number of different public banking efforts. You can go to publicbankinginstitute.org and see many of those listed. That the one that I've spoken with in detail about overlapping with postal banking has been the Oakland East Bay group. It's a longstanding group that's been focused on public banking, and they would love to have a pilot be done just in the East Bay area of the San Francisco Bay. And I think that's it. I'll just reserve the time, extra time for answering questions later on. So go ahead, Max.
Thanks, Mark. And now we have James and John from New York DSA. And let me note that the first few questions in the Q&A seem very well directed to you as well. So as you go along, you might want to address them as well. So with that, take it away.
Sounds good, and I think we'll do that. And hi, I'm James, joined here by John. We're from the New York City DSA Debt and Finance Working Group, and John is gonna set up the issue.
Hey everyone, so if we go to the next slide, please. We're gonna breeze through these because I want to make sure we have enough time for questions and to talk about our postal banking campaign as well. But I'll be covering these topics. What are these banks? Why don't we trust them? What is public banking? And then we'll talk about our campaigns. And feel free to ask questions in the chat if anything comes up that you are curious about. This is typically how we present or talk about this subject. What are banks? Banks, they take money, they hold money, and they lend money. That is their three functions. They can make more in loans than they're required to hold, which is called fractional reserve banking. And this allows them to be a very integral component in the logic of capitalism. So, you know, Marx formulated that as M, C, M prime. Money turns into capital, which turns into more money. If you are a capitalist, you get money, you buy capital, you use it to make more money. If you have capital, you can then convert it into money by collateralizing it, getting a loan from a bank. This isn't an arcane Marxist academic point. It means that banks are a means of producing value. And if we believe that the means of producing value in society should be democratically controlled or publicly owned, that includes banks. There are three general types of banking. Not all banks are the same. There are retail banks, which you can cash your check at, make a deposit, have a savings account. There are commercial banks, which make loans with companies, and investment banks, which typically finance large capital projects. Next slide, please. So why don't we trust private banks? Next slide, please. So for one, they are criminal enterprises. They are routinely engaged in fraud to the highest degree. These are just a couple of headlines from recent scandals. And when they are not committing fraud, they are also destabilizing the global financial system by speculatively inflating asset prices. Also, we cannot rely on private for-profit institutions to repair historical or present racial injustices. We do not just live in a capitalist system, we live in a system of racial capitalism. And banks are a key component of that. Next slide, please. So generally, banks have monopoly on the provision of credit. Credit is social infrastructure like access to the internet or a library. It is something that everyone needs to fully participate in society. And so by giving them a monopoly on that, we're giving them too much power over something that should be a public good. The profit incentive means they prioritize profitable things and not useful or good things. So things with faster and privatized returns get financed, and things with long-term socialized returns don't. So as an example, here in New York City, we have Hudson Yards, a $3.5 billion real estate boondoggle instead of more social housing. So what are the implications for government? Government, state and local, need to borrow just like people do. Municipal finance is kind of the outer boundary of municipal government. It really determines what governments can do. But borrowing is very tightly regulated. In just about every state in the country, there are constitutional and statutory debt limits, tight regulations on borrowing, and credit rating agencies don't help. They can make borrowing very expensive. Banks also charge lots of fees and then use our tax dollars when we're depositing tax dollars in them for evil by loaning to things like the fossil fuel industrial complex. What are the implications for people? Well, it's hard to build political pressure to finance big, publicly useful things. It's hard to get financing for socialist things like worker cooperatives. And nearly 1 million people in New York City are unbanked or underbanked. Banks perpetuate redlining and patterns of racist disinvestment and then finance gentrification. They also charge lots of fees to people like, us, and then use our tax dollars for evil. This is a map showing underbanking in New York City. You can see the pattern maps onto historically redlined neighborhoods. Next slide, please. What is a public bank? It is a bank except wholly owned and operated by the government. It has no profit incentive. It only needs to break even. If it does make profits, they can be reinvested in the public coffers. It can be run democratically, and it can be required by law to prioritize the things that everyone cares about, to be transparent and to serve everyone. Next slide, please. This is our current system. We pay taxes to municipal government. It deposits that money in big banks, and then they invest that money in evil things. And then they make private profit that goes to shareholders. In a public banking system, our taxes would go to deposits in a public bank, which would invest in things that we care about and have a say in investing in, and then profits would be reinvested in the community. Next slide, please. What can public banks do? I just kind of covered this, but they can promote racial equity, lower borrowing costs for local government, support community and economic investment, public works, infrastructure, et cetera. A lot of this has been covered already. Next slide, please. These are more slides about, using housing as an example. Next slide, please. If you can lower borrowing costs by making loans to government institutions and nonprofit developers that have below market rate interests or no interest rates, you can actually calculate, how much lower the rents would be, and it's dramatic. Next slide, please. Who else agrees with us? Communist North Dakota, they've had a public bank since 1919. It is a commercial bank primarily. It partners with local banks and businesses, and it's done a lot of good for the state of North Dakota. Next slide, please. This has real world consequences. It's not just that you can get your student loan from the Bank of North Dakota instead of, Sally Mae or whatever. North Dakota had more PPP funding per worker than any other state in the country. And public banking has a very long history. Public banks were common in the early United States. We had postal banking for a period of 50 or so years. Reconstruction Finance Corporation, which was spun off into the Small Business Administration. It was kind of the engine of the New Deal. It was a public bank at the federal level. New York almost established a public bank in 1975 in order to save the state from a fiscal crisis. And public banking is very common around the world, including in Germany, and then large investment banks in a lot of the countries that aren't the United States, honestly. And so from here, I'll kick it to James, who will talk about our current campaigns. Thank you.
Yeah. And hi, everyone. I'll be quick about this, but just want to update everyone about what we've been doing here in New York. And this is a slide that we've taken from the PBI, the Public Banking Institute. This is the state of play in 2018, about where you've got public banking initiatives that have been underway. And you'll see the red or orange color in New York, because we've been moving forward with it here. Specifically, we've been working on the New York Public Banking Act. And this is very similar to what, again, Mark mentioned was done in California. And I saw someone in the chat asked, they passed a law in, I think, October 2019 that would allow or enable the local chartering of local public banks. And you haven't had any chartered or created just yet. But what we're doing in New York, we're looking to do the same in the coming session. We've got dozens of legislators already lined up. We've got the chair of the banking committee in the Senate and in the Assembly. It's S5565 if you guys want to look it up. but it would enable the local chartering of banks throughout New York State. It's already been drafted and introduced. And we've got public banking coalitions in New York City and in Rochester, and we're working on creating a few more. But we've got to have a statewide effort to really make this work and get it past the post. After we pass that, though, that's not the end of our work. We're working here in New York City to hopefully create a public bank right in the belly of the beast. And it's something that we're looking to electoralize in the coming year. So NYC DSA, we've got a slate of candidates who are running for city council. There are dozens of city council members who are just term limited out. So we're looking to pass the New York Public Banking Act at the state level, and then shortly after that to have the people in New York City who can hopefully do this the right way. And it's important that we do it the right way and not just rush it along, because just the simple fact that you've got a public bank, it's not necessarily a good thing. It depends on how you use it. So we've been consulting with economists, and we've got to be careful so that it's not just a way of adding a bit more state capital to private financial institutions or groups that do bad things. So for instance, if Governor Cuomo were in charge of a public bank, it could be used to do all sorts of bad things, teaming up with Amazon or businesses that exploit their workers. And we want to avoid that. And we want to be very deliberate about avoiding that. There's also recently introduced the Federal Public Banking Act. So AOC and Rashida Tlaib introduced this pretty recently. And this would allow, and it would, would Cuomo ever sign a bill like this? I see David asking in the chat. One, I think he would if we had a lot of support for it. But two, we have a supermajority in the legislature now, so we wouldn't even really need him if we could do this properly. But it's also something that's revenue neutral to do, so he wouldn't. It would be tough for him to object to it. We've been having some conversations, but yeah, just barely a supermajority. But yeah, we've got it. So at the federal level, AOC and Rashida Tlaib introduced this. It provides some mechanisms for providing tier 1 capital to local public banks throughout the country. And I'll try to be clear. I'll try to be quick about this. There's one last thing. The postal banking campaign is something that came up a few times before, but in 2016, 2017, DSA in New York State teamed up with the APWU. I saw Dennis O'Neill in the chat. He was our point person for this. We collected thousands of signatures, tens of thousands. Maybe he could put in the chat the exact numbers if he remembers. But it would have, we collected a bunch of signatures with the goal of creating a pilot program for postal banking in the Bronx, which John pointed out is a huge banking desert in New York State. And the beauty of this, and something that we might want to think about as we're organizing going forward, is that you don't need Congress to do this. All we would have needed was the Bronx Borough President and the Postmaster General. And I saw someone ask a question about why this failed the last time around. We had a window where we still had the Postmaster General was an Obama appointee, but now we've got the worst people in the world in charge. So getting that approval from the Postmaster General, it doesn't seem like it's something that's going to happen on December 13th, 2020, or anytime really soon. But with that, we'll wrap it up, try to exercise some of that time discipline, and open it up for questions, or send it back to Max.
Thanks, James. Well, the first one from Levi Rose, how can local chapters help the USPS, and how can that help grow locals? Maybe James and John would be best to talk about it from the DSA end.
Sure. And that's also something that I'll give some space for the APWU people to talk about. But like I mentioned, the pilot program strategy might need to wait for the next Postmaster General. We've been largely shifting our efforts towards public banking in the meantime, since it seems like it's been very hard, and focusing our efforts on just saving the post office from its existential threat. But with the Biden administration, we maybe have a chance to shift back towards postal banking legislation. It's something, I mean, the election just happened a month ago, so I think we all need to reorganize, but if you're in a local DSA chapter, or if you're in the APWU, I think it's something that everyone needs to seriously talk about. And it's good that we're having conversations like this, because organizing, it takes, it's great if everyone calls their Congress member, but it's even better if we add on to that like an actual strategy and organization. But I don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that.
I can say a few words, Max, if you don't mind. So, one of the things, just with respect to the immediate fight of saving the Postal Service, again, is to reiterate that we need COVID relief, a big check basically to keep the Postal Service afloat. We're looking at $25 billion. That's one. One interesting wrinkle I'll put on James's point is the Postmaster General is actually not presidentially appointed. This person is hired and fired by an independent board of governors whose members are presidentially appointed. So the Biden administration will come into the White House in January with vacancies on the postal board. We are asking that they fill those vacancies with pro-postal banking governors on day one. And that can be something folks can organize around. And just with respect to, organizing at the local level, I know there's been a number of chapters that have made this a focal point for their chapter. Philly did a number of virtual town halls. I spoke on one of them. You get people on a Zoom, talk about why the Postal Service is important to them and to their community, and then everybody goes on mute for 5 minutes and called their Congress people there. So it was a way to build a little community and take some collective action while learning about how the Postal Service matters to people. I thought that was a great idea. And you can reach out to the folks in the Philly chapter if you want to hear about how they did that. So.
Thanks, Steve. I wonder if you would like to react to the second question. What do you expect from the Biden administration as far as the service goes?
Look, we think we will have some space to improve things, right? The fight over the Board of Governors that I just mentioned is a really important one. We know that the board as currently constituted is the group of folks that hired Louis DeJoy, and the Postal Service largely operates independently of the presidential administration. So the best way for the Biden administration to have an impact on how the post office runs is to use the bully pulpit and talk about why the Postal Service is valuable and why things like postal banking could be helpful. All that would be a bonus, and we've asked them to do that. But more substantially is to appoint people onto this board that will hold the Postmaster General accountable and pursue the types of policies that we're supportive of. Expanding services is one of our most central goals, and postal banking is right at the heart of that.
Thanks, Steve. On the next question, I'm going to interject something and then ask Mark to address it. About credit unions, there's nothing wrong with credit unions. One of the driving forces or motivations for postal banking is universal accounts. Everyone gets an account. Now, more credit unions might be useful to get more people banked in some way or another, but to get everybody some kind of account is really up to the federal government. And one potential bonus of that, which is hopefully not too far-fetched, is that when we have a honking big recession like we have now, if everybody had accounts, it would be very easy for the federal government to immediately pass stimulus checks, money to everybody, and have a countervailing effect on the collapse of employment that we are seeing right now. There are other possible uses for those accounts, but a driving force for postal banking is to make sure everybody gets banked. And with that, let me pass it to Mark about some of the differences between public, postal, and credit unions.
Thanks, Max, for saying that, because what you're talking about goes to the heart of this universal banking services. And I want to go back to President Simpson's map that she put on the screen, and you can do this exercise in virtually any rural, semi-rural, or semi-urban area. Look at the footprint of post offices compared to the footprint of banks or credit unions, for that matter. And it's much more realistic to have post offices provide banking services than it is to open credit unions in the same footprint there are with post offices. I mean, it would cost a prohibitive amount of money to open credit unions, 30,000 credit unions throughout the U.S. Whereas if you just provide additional banking services through the post offices, and by the way, post offices already are in the money services business. There's check cashing, there's some form of bill payment, et cetera, and money transfers that the post offices currently do. All we're asking for is to expand that set of financial services that are provided, in addition to providing banking accounts. And one other point about that map, and that is that the post offices are where the people are. Whereas if you look at where the commercial banks are, they're where the money is. I mean, they're in commercial areas where there's a lot of transactions. And if we really do want to provide universal banking to the population, that means providing banking services through the existing set of infrastructure that we have, which is post offices. In terms of differences between credit unions and banks, just keep in mind that credit unions are limited because of the banks, so that they can only lend out 11% of their portfolio to commercial accounts. So if you look at the services that credit unions provide, by and large, it focuses on consumers, which is fine. When you're talking about postal banking, that's focused on consumers as well. But credit unions are federally limited because of legislation that the banks sponsored to make sure the banks did not have competition. So all in all, we could roll out credit unions to all 30,000 locations of the post offices, but that's a very expensive and unrealistic proposition. That's it.
Yeah. And if I could just add to that real quick, there's a book, How the Other Half Banks, by Mirza Baradaran, which is very good, which talks about what Mark was just explaining about how the federal legislation has really kneecapped credit unions. And another thing that I'll just add, credit unions, I think that they're not covered by the Community Reinvestment Act, and not all credit unions are created equal. So, for instance, you could have the Polish and Slavic Federal Credit Union or the Pentagon Credit Union, but I wouldn't necessarily count on them to, promote racial equality or to have the kinds of services that we might otherwise be able to legislate around.
Just on the political point, Max, when we get resistance from the credit unions on this, and they say, well, this is something we could do, we don't want the Postal Service stepping into our space. I think the very simple retort is that, why aren't you doing it, right? Look at the numbers, and on its face, there's 80 million people that aren't receiving the service they need. So if they want to do it, let them go and do it. We're not in the business of putting credit unions out of business. What we want to do is explore ways that the Postal Service can help serve the public and meet needs of people that aren't having them addressed by the existing system.
Thanks, Steve. There's a question about North Dakota. Does anybody care to address it? I'm so old, I remember Senator Byron Dorgan, who was great, but he's long gone, and North Dakota's sunk into the whirlpool of really right-wing politics. So can anybody speak to what the North Dakota Bank is doing, or?
What's the question? I'm looking for it right now.
It's from Bennett Pearson.
Okay, so the Bank of North Dakota has one retail location. The CEO has said on record that if they were to do it again, they would not provide any retail services. They would simply be a commercial wholesale bank. And so folks need to keep in mind that retail banking is kind of a pain in that, you know, you've got a varied set of requirements you need to meet. But the thing that you really want out of retail banking is the deposits in order to enhance your balance sheet. And so if you can gain the deposits through wholesale banking, then you don't really need to do retail banking. I mean, there are definitely limitations within the retail banking world, which is precisely why credit unions are not all over the place and why banks are closing their retail locations quite a bit. There's a lot of consolidation going on in the industry, which is leaving the retail customers out cold.
Well, it sounds like the best days of the Bank of North Dakota may be behind it, but the fact that it existed and functioned, I think, is more to the point than the limited space in which it might be operating now. Are there any other questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Just one more thing on the Bank of North Dakota. I mean, they are growing every year. Every year they increase their profits. I mentioned earlier about how a bank has a license to create credit on their balance sheet. The Bank of North Dakota has created $6,000 on average per capita on their balance sheet. So that is non-tax revenue. Imagine in any city or country or state, if we had $6,000 per capita of money that was floating around commercially, and so it needs to be paid back, but it's money that forwards the economy to build out solar, to do a number of other things that reflect our values. In North Dakota, they're doing it, and you know, that's just an important service that they provide, not the retail banking services.
Thanks, Mark. Other questions? Bridget Boyle asks about, let's see. Can somebody address her question?
I can real briefly, and that is that, you know, when an institution makes a loan, they can either use existing money, which is what money lenders do, and check cashing places, or what a bank does is they write credit into their balance sheet. The cost is much lower when they create the money themselves and put it on their balance sheet. So you have a lower cost of money when you are a depository institution and you can create credit. And so therefore, theoretically at least, the rates for the person receiving the loan can be less. And so a postal bank can do either, depending on if it has a depository license or not. But keep in mind that if it is going to lend out other people's money, the cost for doing that, because it will need to pay interest back to the person who's originally lending the money, whether it's a deposit or whatever, the cost for doing that is going to be higher than if it were a depository institution.
Yeah, I assume if we had a postal bank, they would keep separate accounts between revenue from stamps and the like for mailing and a banking division. So
yes,
as things stand, the mail component of it would, in my view, ought to get outside funding rather than force operations to be financed solely by revenue from stamps and package delivery fees. There's also a question about, could a public bank issue credit cards? And that seems like an easy one. Why not? I mean, the government already issues cards to recipients of food stamps, what used to be called food stamps. So that seems like a no-brainer to me, but others are welcome to chime in if they like.
Yeah, it could do it if it wanted to get in that business.
And then from Steve Diamond, what are the central barriers to getting this done? Well, we talked a lot about that. Maybe Steve could pick up on that.
The banks don't like it, for starters, and they've got a hell of a lot of political influence. So we need to continue to build a people's movement that's demanding this. And I think that's, part of the reason why we're here today, for starters. And then the other thing is, look, others have mentioned this, and I should say it as well. We've met resistance from the Postal Service, from postal management. Certainly, even previous postmasters general with whom the unions had very good relationships or decent working relationships, they saw this as not part of their central mission, not really in their wheelhouse. They, have argued they want to be in the business of moving paper and packages around the country, and that's fine. That's what the Postal Service has traditionally done, but not always, right? The Postal Bank that I mentioned existed from 1911 to 1967. We need to continue to build political support in the White House and Congress, but also with the Postal Service, and get them to understand that this would be beneficial to the Postal Service and an extension of their mission. I like to think about it from a postal user. The story I often tell, I spent a number of years living and working in Switzerland when I was representing the global union that brings postal unions together all around the world. And my only bank account there in Switzerland, the heart of the global banking sector, was at the post office. And if you got something, if you ordered a pair of shoes, say, from an online retailer, and they came to your house delivered by your postal worker and they didn't fit, you would just walk them to the post office to return them. And the postal clerk would be trained to accept that package of shoes, kind of shake it and say, yeah, it feels like shoes, good. And then that person would immediately credit your postal spending account. So you could go home. If you were a person of modest means, that money would be back in your account again, and you could go and buy the right size pair of shoes. And that would keep you happy because you're getting the thing that you actually needed. It would keep the retailer happy because you would be, in fact, a repeat customer and not a lost customer. And it keeps the Postal Service happy because it keeps more shit moving through the mail as well. So there's this sort of virtuous cycle that would happen because you were able to tie traditional postal services to postal financial services. So we think there's a really good case to make with management too, that this is beneficial to the post office and really goes a long way in addressing the needs of so many.
Thanks. One thing to keep in mind, that in one sense, this is really an old struggle. I mean, the whole history of the Postal Service is a tussle between the Postal Service, formerly the Post Office Department, and private industry as to who was going to be able to do what. Originally, the Postal Service, Post Office then, owned the telegraph, and they were forced to give up a potentially lucrative business. So here in the US, because the post office functions have been so narrowed, we're less sensitive to the scope of what it might have done or might be doing now that are done in other countries. First and foremost, postal banking, but conceivably aspects of the internet. I mean, why do we have to have, why don't we have public counterparts to things like Facebook and Twitter that are pouring all kinds of sewage into the political dialogue? So there's a potential there which people aren't so aware of in the U.S. because we've seen so little of it so far. I mean, we have tech monopolies instead of an enlarged postal service. We have Wells Fargo, which took over a lot of package delivery. We have the private banks, which replaced the postal banking system in the U.S. And we have all these tech monopolies that are making oodles of money and providing lousy service of one type or another to us. And we don't have choices in the U.S. So in one sense, it's not new. It waxes and wanes. Right now, I think we're more on an upturn in terms of starting to get to take more of the initiative. But this is not something fundamentally new in terms of public policy or even in U.S. politics. And with that, we're out of questions, I think. Oh, David asked about a public counterpart to Facebook. I mean, we have nonprofit examples, and potentially something like one of them could be scaled up and provide alternatives, both in terms of Facebook, Twitter, search, all the things that have incidentally destroyed the local newspaper business in the US by just sucking in all the ad revenue, as well as all the political damage those things have been doing. I mean, you can go on Google and do searches and get led to just ridiculous documents and videos. So that's something more in the future than right now, but we have a foothold on postal banking, and I think we can pursue that. So with that, let me ask each participant if they would like to wrap up, say anything they wish they had said that didn't quite come out. And we'll go in the same order we began with. So Jan Simpson, would you like to say goodbye at any length?
I just want to say, we've all heard great presentations today, and reasons even more so why Canada and the US should pursue postal banking, because the pandemic, we saw even more so, like Stephen said, the post office is the most reliable brand that they have. And right now I feel with the pandemic, we have an opportunity to reopen the society and ensure postal banking is there for everybody. And I encourage you all to go to cupw.ca and look about our postal banking campaign that we have. And it's been great being here this afternoon, hearing great ideas. And I look forward to work with everybody again around the postal banking.
Thanks. Yeah, definitely everybody plug whatever this is the time to do it, if that's what you want to do. Steve?
Just to repeat what I said at the top, the union's appreciation for the massive solidarity of DSA chapters and members all across the country. This year and in years past too, I'm glad my brother Dennis is on. That's been a great partnership in New York with James and John and the whole chapter there. And let's keep working together. The Postal Service is a national treasure. It's something we absolutely have to defend. Not just for what it's doing now, but for what we want the Postal Service of the future to be. So we're just thrilled to be in the struggle with you and look forward to so much great organizing in the future.
Thanks. Mark?
Yeah, I just want to let everyone know that one of the reasons why there's been a fair amount of success with public banking in California is that they're not adverse to making real specific proposals in the form of legislation to legislators. And so what you end up doing is really forcing decisions. And I think we all need to do more of that. And so if anybody is interested in postal banking and joining forces in the public banking world, please go to publicbankinginstitute.org, see who your local contacts are, and let's make postal banking happen.
Great. James?
Yeah, I mean, just to echo what everyone else was saying, it's great to be here. We put our email address in the chat if anyone ever wants to reach out afterwards. And looking forward to working with everyone going forward.
Okay. John, you want to sign off with anything?
Sure, thank you. I would just, I think Stephen mentioned something earlier about building a movement behind this, and I think that's really, really important. And also what Mark said about having specific demands. To the question about whether or not a public bank could, could offer credit card services or something like that, whatever form any of this takes, a public bank or a postal bank, will depend upon the demands that constituents are making, and legislators and elected officials will only listen if many people are making those demands and are united together. So I think a movement is necessary, and I hope to work with all of you towards that.
Thanks. Well, that's a good note on which to adjourn. So thanks to everybody for participating and for attending with your questions, and hope to see you all somewhere else sometime soon.
Thanks, Max.
Bye.
Thanks, Max. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Max. Bye, everybody.